Welcome to the Anglotopia podcast. This is a special podcast because there's been a major news story in the world. The Queen has died. And while this is an event that many have expected for a long time, it's something that we were never ready for. And it's been a interesting week in British politics and British history and British culture. And so I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about it with everybody because I have some thoughts. Now, the passing of a monarch and the accession of a new one is a strange dual event in British history because on the one hand, you have the death of a monarch, the passing of an era, the mourning of the loss. And on the other hand, you have the accession of a new king, a new monarch, the beginning of a new era, and all the pageantry and pomp that goes with that. And so they're happening concurrently. And so it's been a really fascinating few days. So I thought I would sort of go back and talk about how the week played out and go on from there. So it was supposed to be just a regular week in British politics. It was a week that had been waited for about 6 weeks. The election of a new prime minister or a new leader of the Conservative Party was going to be over, and Boris Johnson was going to formally resign, and then the new prime minister would be appointed. It was either going to be Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak. I'm not going to get political. That's not what this is about. And so on Monday, it was announced that it would be Liz Truss as the new prime minister. But then it was also announced that the Queen would not return to London to do the, quote, kissing of the hands. She would not return to Buckingham Palace where Boris Johnson would formally resign, and then Truss she would be asked to form a government. Like, she would not do that. I mean, that was a big departure from tradition alone, but it was said that her doctors recommended that she not travel. So that meant the prime minister and the new leader had to go to Balmoral in Scotland, where the Queen has been for most of the last couple months. And so on Tuesday, we were presented with the pictures of the formal transfer of power, the kissing of the hands. The Queen asked Liz Truss to form a government, and all the wheels went in motion for that, as they normally do, just with the added historical context that this was unusual. And many people, me included, when they saw the pictures of the event in Balmoral, were sort of alarmed because the Queen looked frail, and she's looked frail this whole past year. I mean, she's 96 years old, or she was 96 years old, and she had some really bad bruising on her hands, and she looked much worse than she had previously. And so fast forward to Thursday, and we're based out here in California now, so we're 8 hours behind London time. So like things sort of happen in the middle of the night while we're sleeping. And so I woke up and saw all these alerts on my phone that the Queen was very ill, and the rest of the royal family was urged to head to Balmoral. And so I knew immediately that this was probably it. So I turned on my BBC News feed and basically watched and waited while I worked and sort of prepared for the inevitable. And then, sure enough, about mid-morning here, the news came that she had died. And then I watched it live from the BBC. Hugh Edwards announced it. It was strange. The news alert on my Apple Watch notified me before anything else did by seconds. I mean, it wasn't like a significant amount of time. And that was it. The second Elizabethan age was over. And I'm not gonna lie, I got very emotional in that moment. I cried. It was very upsetting. It's, like I said, it's one of those things we've expected for years, but you can never really be ready for. And it was very upsetting. And then So immediately, once the Queen died, Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, he became king. There's no gap in power. There's no formal ceremony that has to take place right away. Those come later. Like the crown passes, the crown is immortal, the crown does not die, and it immediately passed to Charles, and he became king. And within hours, it had been confirmed that he had chosen Charles III as his regnal name, and that this was the new reality, and it was all so surreal to watch play out on Thursday. And yeah, it's been an interesting week. So, as an American, it's kind of weird that I have this fascination for the British royal family, but I'm not the only one that does. There are lots of reasons why Americans cared so much about Elizabeth, but I think the major reason is that she was such a permanent fixture on the world stage and a calming force for the world. And this force of a person who was never meant to be the reigning monarch, but took on the role and performed her duties. Her famous quote was, "Never complain and never explain." And people really admired that. And while the royal family has had their, plenty of scandals and plenty of dramas, the Queen has sort of always been this steadying force in British cultural life and in the wider world. And she was very beloved in America. I mean, I lost count of how many American presidents that she had met and received. Some not so great, some perfectly wonderful, but she had to meet them all. She had 15 prime ministers of Britain. Her first prime minister was Winston Churchill. That is a baffling and fascinating fact, that her reign started with Britain's greatest prime minister and wartime leader and ended with Liz Truss being prime minister for essentially 2 days. And it's so bizarre. So, one question I get asked a lot about is, why do Americans care so much about the British royal family and the Queen? And I think there's a lot of reasons why. And I'm going to talk about those reasons because I think they're interesting. And you can talk back in the comments and see if you agree with me or not. And, why do we care so much about the royal family when we make such a big point of having gotten rid of the royal family back in 1776? And I think it's because when you look back in that historical context, independence was never. There was like 30% of colonists who did not want independence from Britain, and when the war ended and we had our independence, they still wanted to have the king, and some fled to Canada, some fled further afield, and many just stayed and maintained their affection for their lost king, and they're kind of a silent constituency. And that kind of thread continued in American society and culture, that maybe some people thought we were better off with the royal family, but we decided to go on a different path. And I think the sort of second element is more far-reaching. Many Americans have deep British roots. I was reading up that according to an Ancestry.com survey from a few years ago, nearly 72 million Americans have British roots. And by British, I mean English, Scottish, Welsh. That's almost as many people as currently live in the United Kingdom. And while other sort of ethnic groups in America, like Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Mexican Americans, African Americans, have well-defined and vocal constituencies and identities, many Americans of British descent don't really have that, or they're kind of a silent minority. And I think that manifests itself in this appreciation for the royal family and all things British. I mean, British TV and British culture is so incredibly popular here. And these quote British Americans have kind of blended into American life. And many of these Americans will remember their ancestors and where they came from, and sort of have a inbuilt fondness for the royal family as a consequence. And the Queen was the embodiment of that, just because she was such a good person, a good figure. My own story is very American. I wrote about this in my book a few years ago. When we traced my ancestry, I found deep American roots going back to the mid 1800s, but I was still able to find that I had English ancestors, and they came from a small village in Durham called Shincliffe. And it's mind blowing to think that these people, they were born in a cottage in northern England and decided to seek better opportunity in the new world, and they abandoned everything they knew and sailed to America when it was still incredibly dangerous to do so, and started a new life. And that became, you know, a part of my familial identity. And when I visited the village a few years ago, I felt immediately at home, despite 150 years separating me from my ancestors there. And there's a lot of Americans like me who have this ancestry, who have an affinity for British things just because it's part of our DNA, it's part of who we are. And a lot of Americans, they like to say that because we're a young country and we only have a couple hundred years of history, we're always kind of searching for deeper roots and deeper history than we actually have. And going back to the old country, going back to our British roots gives us, cements our ancestry in a place that's endured for 1,000 years, or depending on how far back you go. And we're sort of connected to that continuum of British history. And while we have sort of gone on our own path, the base of American cultural life is the laws and structures and ideas that came from the English common law tradition, the British cultural tradition, and the British political tradition. And we've sort of taken those ideas and created our own thing from it. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I think because of that, we still have this affinity for anachronistic things like a royal family. And, in America, our politics are very divisive. Our head of state is a political figure. But also an administrative figure. Whereas in Britain, you have the reigning monarch is an apolitical figure. They don't participate in politics. They don't have opinions. They serve the nation. They kind of represent all the people. And I think that that would be kind of nice to have, instead of having to argue every 4 years over who should be president, and getting in one camp and vehemently disagreeing with the people in the other camp, and creating this divisive environment that we have that's especially bad right now. It sure would be nice to have a head of state who was apolitical, in my opinion. I think another element of why there are so many American Anglophiles and who love the royal family is that after World War, there were a lot of U.S. servicemen who passed through Britain fighting for freedom against the Nazis, who found themselves falling in love with the local British women. And it's estimated that there were something like 70,000 war brides who moved to America after the war, starting new lives with their American husbands. But they never stopped being English or British, and they had hundreds of thousands of children, which led to hundreds of thousands of grandchildren, and they all had an affinity for their mother's homeland or their grandmother's homeland, and sort of had that inbuilt appreciation of where their mother came from, and the things that she would have experienced and the things that she would have appreciated, like a queen. Everyone loved to listen to their mother's stories about the old country, and probably watched as she cried on Coronation Day. And you can move to a place and live your whole life in a place and still maintain that connection to where you came from. And I think down the generational lines, that's where we get this popularity of all things British and royal in America. And then I think there's a final element worth mentioning, is that British culture is deeply embedded in American society. And while it's well known that American culture and Hollywood movies and American music dominates world culture and is very popular, I would argue that British culture is the second most popular cultural force in the world. It's cultural currency, and from Harry Potter to James Bond and Jane Austen and Doctor Who and In my own life, I grew up with Roald Dahl and Mr. Bean and Doctor Who being critical parts of my childhood and adolescence. And British culture is everywhere in America, and we can't get enough of it. And there's constantly new things coming. And, from even as recently as Great British Bake Off, which became a massive hit here, people love British things. And you only have to look at how much money the last Downton Abbey movie made to know that there's huge appetite for this kind of thing. And it's, British culture is everywhere in America, and we appreciate it. And that's what led me to start Anglotopia, because I wanted a website dedicated to all things British. So it's only right that we American Anglophiles had such an affection for the Queen. She was Britain's grandmother, and I would argue to some extent she was America's grandmother too. And like I said earlier, I cried yesterday when they announced she died. This is a woman who is not my queen. I'm not a British subject. I'm an American. But I was still very sad that she had died. I'm still very sad about it. But it's also an auspicious time because, now the queen is gone. She has left the stage. It's time for a king to enter the stage. And, the queen leaves a powerful legacy. And she was this permanent fixture in the world, a sort of a permanent thing in an impermanent world, and now she's gone. But now we can see her legacy in her son, Charles, who is now King Charles III. He's the living embodiment of her legacy, and I think through him, Elizabeth will continue. As I said earlier, the crown is immortal, it is permanent, and now it's on Charles's head. And over the years, there's been a lot of gossip and talk. People were like, well, we don't want Charles to be king, and we'd rather skip over him and go right to William, and, with all the scandals and whatnot, and, he's not suitable. And, as we saw this week, a lot of that immediately disappeared as soon as he was king. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be without criticism at all, but he immediately stepped into the role, and so far, 2 days in, he's nailed it. His speech yesterday to the nation was heartfelt. It was perfect. He delivered it perfectly. He's and granted, I know there's an element of stage management, and I know he didn't write his speeches. I know that he's being told what to do, but he's fulfilling the role that he needs to fulfill for a nation in mourning, but also celebrating the accession of a new monarch. And, it's monarchies work. They're hereditary. You don't get a say in who the next monarch is. It just happens. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people outside of Britain struggle with is, well, you don't get a say? Yeah, well, no, you don't get a say. It was always going to be Charles. He's in his 70s. And if you base, his longevity based on the longevity in his family, he's probably going to reign for 20 or 30 years. So we are now in the new Carolinian age and the reign of King Charles III. And it's really hard to get used to saying that, to saying King Charles and the king. A minor amusing thing is, since we started Anglotopia, we had a section on the site called The Queen, which is where all the articles about the Queen went. I had to create a new section of the site for the king, because now there's the king, and all the things about the king will go there. And it's such a weird, minor thing, but it's like, oh, I got to do that now. And now, we won't be talking about the Queen. We'll be talking about the king. And I was saying on Twitter the other day that Britain is going to change in 1,000 minor but significant ways in the coming weeks, months, and years. Every aspect of British society is going to be touched in some way. And some things are practical, like there's going to need to be new money. Don't worry, the old money will still be fine until then. They're going to have to redo all the stamps, all the coinage. They're going to have to, when they put in a new post box, it's going to have Charles's cipher. when all the passports are going to have to change. It's no longer Her Majesty's government, it's His Majesty's government. The one thing that kind of got a lot of headlines was, well, the national anthem is going to have to change. It's now God Save the King, not God Save the Queen. And granted, that's a minor update, and no one's officially done it yet, but it's already been done. People were literally down on the Mall in front of Buckingham Palace singing God Save the King on the day it happened. And I highly recommend, and I'll put a link in the show notes because we have it on the site, Catherine Jenkins recorded the famous British soprano, great voice. Highly recommend her work. She recorded a new version of God Save the King, and it was broadcast at BBC Radio 4, and it was beautiful. There wasn't a dry eye in the radio studio when they broadcast it. And I don't think a lot of Americans realize how much Britain is going to change under a new monarch, and it's a fascinating change because it's both sudden and gradual, and they'll just kind of get used to it. So, what is there to expect next? And I think, because we've gotten a lot of questions, and we've gotten a lot of questions on Twitter, and there's kind of a lot to unwrap here. So, as I said earlier, we have the accession of a new king, but we also have the funeral of the old monarch, and that official mourning process is going to last approximately 10 days. So yesterday we had Charles return to London with his new queen consort, Camilla, and he greeted well-wishers, and then he met with his prime minister, and then he made his address to the nation, and there was a service to Thanksgiving at St. Paul's, and there was a lot happened yesterday, even though it wasn't really, a lot of people didn't expect so much to happen that day. And so right now the Queen is still in Balmoral, and then on the 12th, or on the 11th, I'm sorry, tomorrow the 11th, she's going to be taken to Edinburgh, and then she's going to lie in state in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh for a small service and a vigil by members of the royal family. And then on the 13th, it's expected to be flown to London and moved to Buckingham Palace. And then on the 14th, the Queen will begin lying in state at the Palace of Westminster following a procession of the coffin from Buckingham Palace to the Houses of Parliament. I believe it will be held in Westminster Hall, which is the only surviving bit from before the fire of London. It's a beautiful 1,000-year-old space. If you ever have a chance to do a tour of the Houses of Parliament, even if you're not interested in politics, I highly recommend it. The architecture and history there is amazing. And so then she's going to lie in state. And what that means is, the coffin's going to lay there, and she'll be guarded by ceremonial guards. And then the public will have a chance to file past and pay their respects. I expect this to be a very popular thing to do to anybody who can get to London. The British get to practice one of their favorite national pastimes of queuing, because you will be queuing for hours if you attempt to do this. It's going to take a while. There will be lines for days. And then she'll lie in state probably until the 19th, and then which is Monday the 19th of September. They haven't actually formally announced the date yet, but everyone suspects that because a little esoteric thing is they're following something that's called Operation London Bridge, which was the plan for what happens when the Queen dies, and it got leaked a few years ago in a big long article that explained everything. So everybody kind of knows the broad strokes of what's going to happen in the next few days. And so on the 19th, that will be the formal state funeral, and it was just announced today that it's going to be a bank holiday. Everybody has the day off if they want to watch it. I'm sure some people will just enjoy the day off, and that's okay. The funeral is expected to take place at Westminster Abbey. There will be a procession in town probably, and then the coffin will be taken to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, and that's where the Queen will be interred, because that's where her mother and father are interred. That's where Prince Philip is interred, and she'll be laid rest next to him. And I believe that element of the service will be. So that's sort of the details of the funeral. And I'll link to an article we published on Thursday night that kind of details all of this so you can follow along. And I know that you can count on most of the major American networks to cover this. They always cover these big royal events, and this is a world event. They will cover it. I am usually disappointed with how American networks cover these British things. They're oftentimes lacking in understanding in the commentary and a little too, what's the word? I guess they're a little too American in their attitude towards it, a little too excited. So I would recommend, if you can get a feed of the BBC feed, I would watch that. It'll probably be broadcast on the BBC World News Channel. I suspect it might even be broadcast on BBC America. I will use my own private British TV feed that I have through the service TV Mucho, and I'll be able to watch the proceedings live. And I'm sure it'll be broadcast on YouTube. There will not be a shortage of places you'll be able to watch all this coverage, and so that's what to expect. And then, there's all change with the royal family. The line of succession has changed. Everybody has moved up a spot. Titles have changed. I'll link in the show notes to an article that kind of lists all the major titles, but I'll talk about the big ones. The big one is now, and this was announced yesterday officially, that William and Kate, which they were the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, they're now the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge or now the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and Cambridge, because William inherited immediately the Duchy of Cornwall, which was set up 600 or 700 years ago to provide an income for the Prince of Wales. And speaking of Prince of Wales, William is now officially the Prince of Wales. Kate is now officially the Princess of Wales. And, that's going to be a big change for everybody. It's an exciting change. William now sort of takes over the many properties and estates and kind of pet causes that were important to his father, because his father is now that he's king, he can't do a lot of those things anymore. He's busy with the running, with the head of state duties, but also in a lot of his pet causes, he was very political and very opinionated, and he can't have those anymore. And so those will be taken up by William now. And William will, sort of elevate and run these things, and they'll teach him the administrative duties he needs to know to be king. And it's another training opportunity while he prepares for the big day, hopefully a long way from now, when he ascends to the throne. The Camilla is now queen consort. I remember when they got married back in 2005 that there was a lot of hand-wringing over this, that no one really wanted Camilla as queen, but she has really been a great partner and wife to Charles and has excelled as the Duchess of Cornwall for the last 17 years. And I really don't think many people are really upset about her being the queen consort now. And there were some people, when it was announced earlier this year that the queen wished for her to be the queen consort, that some people were upset about it. But I think overall, people are going to be fine with it. And like I said earlier, with a monarchy, you don't really get a say. They can decide what they want to do, and that's how they're going to do it. When I started Anglotopia, and for years, and as a news publication, you kind of have to plan for these things, even though you're not supposed to talk about them, because you don't want to talk. It's not something you want to think about, but you have to. And we always sort of had a plan in place for when this day would come. And I always thought that when the day came, I'd immediately head to the airport and go to London to cover all this in real time from London. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. It's just, we recently had a big cross-country move, family obligations and cost issues. Like, there's just no way I can, and I'm very committed to my day job. There's no way I can just drop everything and go to London to cover the funeral of a head of state who's not mine. And I'm really sort of bummed about that. But I do plan to go to the coronation whenever that is, because now we'll have more time to plan for that. And a lot of the issues that are preventing me from leaving now should have gone away by then. So let's talk about the coronation. So the Charles was king as soon as his mother died. Nothing formal happens. It just, the crown passes. Now, granted, there's been a lot of events, especially today, the accession day, where he was formally proclaimed at the Privy Council, and by the, sorry, my dog is very vocal. She would like to get out of her nighttime crate. So there's a lot of proclamations and stuff that happen after the fact, but the big event is the coronation. So while there's a lot of informal things and, Charles is king immediately, the coronation is always later because the state must go into mourning. There's a period of mourning the previous monarch, and a coronation is a celebration. And so you don't want to have that too close to the mourning and the funeral. And so Elizabeth's coronation was over a year after the death of her father, partly because of the privations of post-war Britain. People just wanted to wait until June when the weather would be nicer. So I suspect that the coronation will probably be in the spring of 2023. So, like I said, I hope to be there. In the meantime, though, we'll be able to provide full coverage of everything that happens over the next few months through our partnerships with the Press Association and the writers that we have on the ground there, and what we can observe from here. So you don't have to worry about our coverage. We'll be providing every aspect as soon as we. So when we celebrated the Platinum Jubilee earlier this year, we released Crown and Glory, which was a tribute to her 70-year reign. And when we were laying it out and designing it, the thought was that we could also use this as a tribute to her when she eventually died. So we're probably going to reissue that, and you can buy it on Amazon, and we're going to sell copies of it. But it's the Crown and Glory is a great guide to her life overall, the effect of her reign, and everything. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So I think that is a good place to stop. It's a fascinating time for Britain to watch as an observer. It's also a very sad time. Over the coming days and months, it's going to be really interesting to watch how Britain changes under its new king. And we'll be providing full coverage along the way. And I'm looking forward to the reign of King Charles III. And I hope you'll all join me in mourning the Queen, but also welcoming the new king into power. That's a good overview of what's happened in the last week, what we can expect in the coming weeks and months. So until then, thank you for listening.